Okay, so today's lesson is lesson 2 from Global Resource Consumption and Security, which is the third unit of the core. So it's the last bit that the SL students will need to do in terms of the core. Last lesson you should have had a look at kind of poverty and the growth of the global middle class. And today we're just going to have a little look at the process of development and how we can sort of use models and stuff like that to explain it. So the process of development, it can be quite a different thing. So when you think about kind of the UK, the US, most European countries, they had a very traditional industrialised development. Because technology didn't spread as quickly as it did now, and because development was very much tied to kind of wealth creation. These days, countries are doing kind of a development leapfrogging thing where they don't have to go through that massive process of industrialisation that happened before. They can tag on to new technologies really quickly and just develop in those sectors, as we've seen in kind of Southeast Asia and the Asian tigers. So the way in which a country develops is a process, and each country kind of experiences that process in a unique way. It will depend on what natural resources they have, where they are in the world, what type of government they have, what the climate's like and what the population's like. So if you think about China, obviously they've got a massive population, and a massive physical area. They've come from a command or communist economy where everything's very heavily governed by the government. So it's a bit of a different situation for them than it would be, say, for a landlocked sub-Saharan African country that's got a kind of incompetent and probably corrupt government, not many natural resources, and a very massive youthful population, but not a lot of working age people. So this kind of process of development can be very different. And one way that we show the process of development is this thing called the Rostow Model. Now, Rostow said that countries go through 5 stages of development. And critically, it kind of assumes that what countries want to do is achieve high mass consumption, which is part 5. As a geographer, I would hope that you might be able to question the legitimacy of that being a desirable outcome of development, and be thinking perhaps a little bit more sustainably about what development should look like in this day and age. So Rostow basically says there's a traditional society where everyone's sort of banging sticks, doing a bit of farming, getting by, hunter-gathering, that kind of thing, kind of a bit of a tribal framework. And then what happens then is what's known as the preconditions for takeoff. So countries start to specialise in certain areas. So some people will do farming, some people do mining, trade starts to happen, and then they develop, in economic terms, what's known as a comparative advantage. So they become quite good at doing something or making something that they can sell to other people. And what happens sort of as a part of this is some infrastructure development. So you will find kind of roads and airports and ports and all of that kind of stuff, maybe train lines. Think about China at the moment and their big sort of Silk Road railway line that they've built. These things are all what are known as the preconditions for takeoff. Often, as part of these preconditions for takeoff, the country starts to attract foreign direct investment. So it may be that they're involved in some kind of large-scale development project like a dam or some sort of big manufacturing deal that another country will invest quite a lot of money in helping them to get this infrastructure together, and then they will give them a percentage cut in whatever it is that they're producing there. This is quite a common thing to see at the moment in Africa with the investment from China. Then what happens is stage 3, the country takes off, the manufacturing sector starts to grow, the service sector starts to grow, more people become employed in knowledge-based economies, and people's wealth and livelihoods start to become a lot better. So between kind of part 3 and part 4, this is where you will see the growth of the middle class, which we're seeing obviously in China and India, and lots of other Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia and Malaysia and all of that kind of stuff. So that's kind of around part 3, part 4. And then finally, this ideal of high mass consumption. So certainly there are a lot of countries that are in this area now. So if we think about South Korea, about Japan, about most European nations, North America, not so much South America, Australia and the sort of countries in Oceania, they're all in this high mass consumption phase. Now, you can see a little bit more detail on here, on this slide, and it just talks to you about this guy, Rostow, an American economic historian. What a fabulous job that must be. And he, his kind of, so you get an idea that that's his perspective. He's an economic historian in the 1960s. So he's looking at countries that had achieved development at that point in time, and the kind of the stages that they followed were quite clear, and they all kind of followed the same stages. Whereas now, although this model does fit, the time spent at the different stages will probably be a lot different than it would have been for kind of France, the UK, the US and countries like that. Okay, so here's Walt Whitman Rostow. What a handsome fella he is as well. I don't have a table for you. You can just make notes on this. I think that would probably be a very good idea. So this model was based on the study of 15 European countries. So as a critique, initially we can see that's quite a narrow amount of data to draw any sort of solid conclusions from. Certainly if you were writing about stuff in your extended essay and you only had 5 bits of data, I would be very concerned about the validity of it. But what was good about his model was that governments and countries and people like the IMF and the World Bank used it as a kind of formula for economic and development success, because he suggested that all countries have got the potential to break the cycle of poverty and develop through these 5 stages. So in the traditional society, we've talked a little bit about this, about it's a subsistence economy. People make what they need to survive rather than trade, or they do a bit of bartering. Agriculture is most important, maybe some fishing, maybe a little bit of mining. That would be a bit about it really. Very limited technology or capital to process the raw materials or to develop industries or services. Okay, if you think about, you might have seen at GCSE a thing called the Clark-Fisher model. Let me see if I find you, hold on. Here's the Clark-Fisher model, and basically what it shows is the 4 different sectors of industry. So red is primary, yellow secondary, this sort of purpley blue colour is tertiary or service industries, and then this nice aqua colour here is the quaternary industry, or the post-industrial knowledge-based economies. And on the y-axis, you can see here the percentage of employment within that sector of the economy. So in a pre-industrial society, which is what we're kind of looking at now, most people, as we've seen, work in primary industry. Okay, and as we start to phase through pre-industrial into industrial, the people that work in agriculture, fishing, mining, that will start to decline, and then it will sort of plateau out. What we also see is there are very few people in service industries to start with, and about a fifth of the population is engaged in secondary industry. So secondary industry is manufacturing and the production of goods, and that starts to increase in the industrial phase. So in terms of Rostow's model, this industrial phase is takeoff. Okay, so this kind of set around this line here is kind of the second phase of Rostow's model. And then this would be the drive to maturity here. And then at the end of the model here would be our high mass consumption situation. So it's quite a good thing to look at, I think, because it just shows you kind of the overlaps in terms of theories. Okay, so the traditional preconditions for takeoff. So you need a surplus from trade. Okay, agriculture becomes more commercialised, so it's not small scale. You get into more extensive farming, using mechanisation. Technological improvements might be things like using GM crops or hybrids, stuff like that. Savings and investments grow, so people have some money. They keep some money, or you also see the emergence of entrepreneurs, so people that start to build businesses. And usually a single industry begins to dominate. Now, in the time that Rostow was looking at, this was often textiles. Then we've got takeoff, so we've got industrialisation. Workers move from the countryside into cities or into larger urban areas. Growth becomes, we see growth poles. Okay, so that means that essentially you see this kind of pattern of core and periphery developing. So you've got core areas where wealth, people, innovation are concentrated, and the peripheral areas start to become a little bit more marginalised. You see the growth of new political and social institutions, so things like trade unions might happen, depending on what kind of government's in power. And you see this airports, roads and railways and infrastructure being built. So these days we'd be looking at sort of technological infrastructure like cell towers and all that kind of stuff. Drive to maturity, now we've got a lot of technological innovation, fairly self-sustaining. Economic development spreads out from the growth poles, so from the cities and the countryside you see less disparity. So there's better connections between the two, and things like education sort of seeps out into the more rural areas, and wealth as well. Manufacturing expands, early industries decline, you see more urbanisation, and you usually see a bit more focus on technological manufacturing. And then finally, there's this idea of high mass consumption. So tertiary industries start to grow, massive knowledge economy, so people working in research and development. We'd be looking at like Google, we'd be looking at sort of the manufacture of microprocessors, and the kind of durable consumer goods. So if you think about like Japan and South Korea, very much illustrate this kind of high mass consumption now. Okay, so there's some criticisms here. I've covered most of them as I've gone along. I'll leave you to have a little read through those. Just make sure that you've got the 5 sections sorted and you understand what the criticisms are.